Thank you very much. So, hi everyone, and happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. For this session, for now, please mute your microphones and put any questions and comments into the chat. And David and Tamsin will then try to answer what they can as I go, and then we'll round up with covering any remaining questions at the end of the presentation. And everything that I'm covering today is accessible from that link, and I think Tamsin is going to paste that into the chat for me. Now, accessibility is always a journey. We'll never reach 100% accessibility, and many of us are at different stages of this journey. And although I've tried to use as many accessible practices as possible in this presentation, and I believe that everything that I'm covering is accurate, but there's always the chance that I've missed something, and I know that I've always got more to learn all the time when it comes to accessibility. And thinking about that journey, how can we within iSolutions move from our current state towards that aim of delivering amazing accessibility, perhaps by picking up our responsibilities in terms of legal compliance along the way. Now, we're with the test community of practice today as well, and I'm sure many would agree that when we think about the cost of bugs, if we find them after release, then that's going to take time and resource to fix, probably more time than it would if we found those bugs earlier on in the life cycle. And that's just the same for accessibility. So when should we consider accessibility? The earlier we consider it, the better. And if we look at this kind of abstract overview of the typical process from setting up the requirements, designing, building, testing, and releasing, if we follow the principles of shifting left to think about accessibility, and not only accessibility, but all aspects of delivery of a new service or upgrade, then the earlier we find, the less it will cost to fix and the better we should be. And I'm going to be looking at how we could look at accessibility in terms of testing, build, design, requirements, as well as looking at the release process. And so I'm going to be telling you what are some of the barriers that users might experience in terms of accessibility, with a few examples from our own sites and services. Look at how we could shift left using examples from the IT sector that I've come across that might be of relevance and use for us. I'm going to show you some practical steps in accessibility testing and talk a little bit about the law and how that affects us. And as is often the case, I have many hidden slides in this deck where you can find lots more information. And I'm not going to talk in this session about why we should care. I had a chance to talk about that a few days ago on our soapbox session, so you can take a look at that. So let's dive in to see what barriers users might experience. And here are a few. They're not, this doesn't cover everything, but a few. Not everyone can use a mouse. It might be because our mouse is broken, we've broken our dominant hand for using a mouse, or we're not able to use a mouse for different reasons. So we need to make sure that sites can use a keyboard, and if they are not operable with a keyboard, then that can be a significant barrier. Likewise, if we have a visual impairment or color blindness, then if we have poor text contrast, so the contrast between the color of the text and the background, or if we're using color as the only way to express meaning, for example, by saying click on the green button, then that's not inclusive to everyone and might present a barrier. Likewise, if you use a screen reader, it's important that the service has been set up in such a way that a screen reader can make sense of it. That often happens within forms, and no one likes being timed out of a website or service without any warning. And here's just a few examples of poor color contrast, or on the right, we can see where we use color as the only form of delivering meaning in that top field where it's highlighted, or the box has red around it, telling us that it's missing some key information. But if we were colorblind, we might not spot that. So the better example below it shows a symbol as well as color. Or if we were using an accordion interface with a screen reader, a poor example might say that it's just a button to press, whereas a better practice is to use a rear markup to say this is a collapsed button, and then to say it's an expanded button. If we were writing or completing a form, Sometimes important information might be put into the placeholder, and once we start typing, we lose that information, which if you had a migraine or any cognitive difficulties, then that's going to be a bit tricky for you. So it's better to keep any of that essential information that's really useful outside of the placeholder. It's not about not using placeholders at all, but assessing what information is most vital and keeping that vital information outside of the placeholder. And of course, here's a good example from the Central Digital and Data Office showing a warning that you're about to time out, because I'm sure many of you will have experienced being timed out before you had finished, perhaps updating your appraisal details or something like that in MyHR. And if you think these sound like typical frustrations, not accessibility issues, researchers found that those top web frustrations map very well to accessibility issues. I've just got some examples there as well. So what about within our own systems? Well, here's an example from the e-assignment system, which covers about 40 to 50% of assignments submitted electronically at the university. This is the admin interface that faculty staff might use. And if you've got good vision and a big monitor, then it's going to work pretty well for you. But if you had poor vision and you wanted to increase the browser zoom, then it's likely you'll find that you're not able to scroll around the screen. You're kind of locked into that part, which makes it quite hard to use. And also, if you were unable to use a mouse, you would find that the focus indicator had been hidden, which can make it very difficult if you're unable to use a mouse, because you can't see, as you make your way using the tab key on the keyboard, you can't see where you're meant to be. Another prescient example was from the university's COVID guidance page. When that was initially set up in March, I found, because it used an accordion design pattern, it wasn't usable with a keyboard, only with the mouse. And because I have a habit of testing these things once I see them, I raised a ticket, but I didn't get any response. Fortunately, I'm within iSolutions, so I can look at the tickets that I raised. And if you were to look at that ticket, you'd see 12 months later hasn't had much activity at all. After a few days of waiting, I emailed Ayala Gordon in the OneWeb team, who then told the right people, in this case I think it was Graham, to fix it. And then within a day it was fixed. So thanks to them for fixing it. But what does this tell us? Or what might this tell us? It might tell us that during the beginning of a pandemic, essential information for university users was not available to those who were unable to use a mouse. And of course, screen reader users will not usually be using a mouse either. And in this example, it only got fixed because we knew the right people. It also tells us that that design pattern, that accordion, wasn't tested for accessibility when it was implemented. And that's not due to a lack of skill or knowledge, because within the person specifications for software engineers, it's an essential requirement. So we can also infer that it wasn't part of the requirements to ensure accessibility, and it wasn't part of the release process to assure accessibility. So again, looking back at this, it's much more important to consider accessibility early in the process. And I'm going to show you examples that I've picked up from companies that have presented on this topic around the world. And some of these might be useful for us, some might not be. It's more to show you what's out there and to kind of get you thinking about what we might want to do within iSolutions. I'm also going to be referring to this Agile Accessibility Handbook, which I really recommend. It's less than 100 pages long and is very practical and has lots of advice, some of which I'll be sharing here. So if we were to think of it in the basics, if we say when we release, only release when it's accessible, and we say in the requirements, let's make sure it's accessible, and we say we're going to test that it is accessible, then everyone who's doing that design and build knows we've got to make sure it's accessible, otherwise it's not going to pass these gates. So we're going to start by looking at testing. So we'll be following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are 3 levels of conformance. The A and AA actually make up the legal requirement for us now, which I'll tell you more about later. And the AAA level is the enhanced level. And I wouldn't necessarily say that meeting A and AA level is amazing, but perhaps using elements of the AAA level once where appropriate are putting us on that journey. The guidelines are broken down into 4 high-level principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, which you will hear quite often when we're talking about accessibility. This is an example of what one of those guidelines look like. They're usually called success criterions or success criteria. They have a name and a number. In this case, it's reflow, begins with the number 1. If it begins with a 1, it's perceivable, that it's related to. 2 is operable, 3 understandable, and 4 is robust. There you've got your level of conformance and then the information about that ruling. That can be quite complex and sometimes impenetrable to read. It's designed by committee and it's written in such a way that should be understandable to people regardless of whether their first language is English. When you look at the actual pages on the web with the guidance, there's always an understanding page and a how to meet page. The understanding page explains what the benefits are, for example, how to test, and the how to meet has a list of sufficient techniques. So how to approach accessibility isn't hidden away in a box behind a riddle. It's all there with worked examples, with example code showing you how to do it. And the best place to look for all of this is this quick reference guide. It's filterable and it holds everything there, and I find that's quite a nice page to work through. So we're aiming at the A and AA level. There's 58 success criteria from there. But if our sites did not involve audio or video, 6 of those criteria relate to audio and video, so we might have less to meet. Some of those AAA levels should be quite reasonable to attain. I've got some examples in the hidden slides within the deck. When we think about testing, we can test with automated tools, with a manual testing, or what's called a guided test. And in this presentation, and I've got lots of these examples which I've got on the deck, which you can then view to find out more. Glenda Sims from DQ Systems, who produce one of the accessibility testing tools, they found that in their over 3 years of testing for new clients, more than 50% of the issues were found using automatic tools. So although automated tools can only actually check for between 30 and 40% of success criteria, they do tend to make up some of the larger amounts of typical issues that we might experience or find. So what's available for us in terms of automated testing? We can use a browser plugin, command line tools, or plug in something to a continuous integration framework. There are many browser plugins, and in the full slide deck, I've listed all of the main ones and talked through their advantages and disadvantages. With accessibility tools such as Google Lighthouse, it's worth reading this page, this blog post, where they show how they are able to create the most inaccessible site possible that still attained a 100% accessibility score. So automated testing is only part of the process. The best tool that I can recommend is Accessibility Insights from Microsoft. When you run it on a page, it will highlight any accessibility issues it identifies and explain them. It will help you to find information about them. And another nice tool is it can have a few additional features, such as showing where your tab stops are, so you can check that if you were to tab through a page using a keyboard, that it goes through in the logical manner. And there's further tools like a grayscale mode, so that you can check that color isn't being used as the only method of expressing meaning. In terms of command line tools, they mainly use Node.js and are delivered through NPM. Axe and Pally are probably the most popular, but there's many more. Here's an example using Axe to test a sample page that I was using for demonstration purposes in an earlier community of practice session. That one found 0 issues, whereas when I tested it with Pally, it found a few other issues. So again, not one single tool is going to be necessarily the best, and it might be requiring us to use several. And there are many to experiment with, and in the handout I have listed further tools that we might want to investigate. Continuous integration is where developers would integrate code into a shared repository kind of frequently, perhaps several times a day. And continuous integration testing involves doing tests automatically during that process. And there are accessibility tools that can plug into that, for example, using Selenium or Travis and so on as well. And a great presentation from Mark Stedman, who also works at DQ, This goes through about 15 minutes of really detailed information about automated testing of JavaScript frameworks. And because we tend to be thinking about front-end development services, that's why it tends to be around the use of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. The accessibility or the Agile Accessibility Handbook, also one of its main recommendations is leveraging an accessibility automation library so that we can try to find, identify, and fix any issues that can be discovered automatically. What automated testing won't find are, for example, this is from the e-assignment system where the keyboard focus outline has been hidden. Right now they won't point out non-descriptive links such as click here. This is a real-world example where some jQuery is being used to automatically mark images that don't have alternative text as decorative, and it won't pick up on that, and it won't know whether the focus order is logical. So there are many areas where we need to do some manual testing. I'm going to talk about some simple tests you can do right now. So in terms of what you would test, you probably want to test a representative page from each kind of page and template that is used on that site, all of the different components that might make up those pages. For example, if that accordion component that we thought about earlier, fixing that meant that all content became accessible or usable because that used that component because we'd fixed the single component. Perhaps some extra pages based on analytics of what are the most popular pages to use, and then having your positive and negative scenarios, for example with module choice, going through module choice successfully, and then negative scenarios where you're making errors as you go and making sure that any of those error conditions are explained appropriately if you're using a screen reader, and that all aspects of it are accessible. So for the pages, you'd be thinking about using an automated tool as well as the manual tests. And then for the positive and negative scenarios, like making sure that they all work with a keyboard and also with a screen reader, and really listening to what the screen reader is saying. So turning off your monitor can certainly help. And it's also good if you're doing the testing with someone who's unfamiliar with the site that you're testing, so that there's no assumptions being made that might interfere with your tests. So that first thing is running those automated tests, verifying whether any failures are real failures. Although most of the automated tests shouldn't provide false positives, it's still worth verifying that those are definitely issues. Then assess their priority. I've got some slides about that later, and reporting it to the dev team or the vendor. Validating the pages is always useful because one of the success criteria is about parsing, that the page has no unclosed tags or anything that might trip up certain user agents. Doing that keyboard test, we did a session on that with the community of practice before, so I've got links here to the recording and the slide deck, but that's effectively using your keyboard, your cursor keys, tab keys, enter and space to make your way around a page. Now, there are also 3 criteria about resizing text, reflow, which is kind of what we think of in terms of responsiveness or increasing the browser zoom, and text spacing. So a good practice is to set your browser window to 1280 pixels wide, and there's a plugin called Web Developer that's very useful for that. Then setting the browser zoom to 400%, and then checking that you can use the site and all functionality without scrolling from left to right. Make sure that the text size has grown 200%, because on some services they might have really fixed the text size, so it's important that we can measure that text size has grown. And if you turn on text sizing with a bookmarklet, which is also linked in the handout, to then as you go unzooming through each media query and breakpoints to be sure that there's no overlaps or missing content. So here's a few examples of what might happen where we have content overlapping other content or content being cut off. And a good example is on the university homepage, where if you were to use the keyboard to move through the top navigation, you'll find that lots of the wording gets cut off, which is not a great look. Testing in grayscale is a good way to check whether we're using color as the only form of meaning. Because if, for example, we were saying click on the green button to submit your assignment, if you're colorblind, you might not know which of those colors was the green one. And it's also useful for testing other kind of, for example, in here with graphs on the left, it's hard to tell in black and white whether which line is which, whereas if we have not using color as the only form of meaning, then it's easier to distinguish, particularly when we're looking in black and white. And as I mentioned, Accessibility Insights has that tool. It's important that any non-text content like images or images of text where we're using a picture of some words instead of machine readable text, that there are alternatives available and that the content appears with a meaningful sequence, because that can impact screen reader usage. So in Web Developer you could turn off CSS styles and images and then make sure that everything is still in sequence, usable and understandable. High contrast mode is used by those who might have a visual impairment, and so that can sometimes make content in some circumstances disappear or be less usable or unusable. So it's worth turning on high contrast and checking that everything works. And that's an example on the right there of the search bar in SUST when you're using it both in the usual way and with high contrast. And you can see that it's still the interface is still clear in terms of high contrast, that nothing has changed. And I've got some links there which have some good tips on adapting services to work well with high contrast mode. Screen readers are what probably most people would think of in terms of accessibility. Most of them are free, apart from JAWS for Windows. And although we can use screen readers and learn to use them, there's nothing like having it being tested by someone who uses a screen reader in their daily life, and even better to have several of those users testing, because it's quite likely that they'll approach a site or service in different ways, and that can help you to get a real understanding of how to make it as usable as possible. And on that note, it's worth considering that slogan, "Nothing about us without us." We shouldn't really be making decisions that are going to affect people with impairments and disabilities without involving them. So it's important that we bring in people with and without impairments and of differing abilities to help us test and co-design our services. But I've got some examples of resources that can help you to learn how to use a screen reader, and James Allen is running the Articulate community of practice, and he's got some excellent resources about using screen readers as well. Color is how we make a lot of our interfaces and services a bit more visually attractive, but how do we know that we're using color in the right way? Here are 9 boxes in rows of 3. The top row, the text, most would agree is hard to read. The bottom row, most would agree is easy to read. What about that middle row? How do we know when the text, or when we're using color, that there's sufficient contrast? So the accessibility guidelines provide a method for us to calculate a contrast ratio. The result is a number, the higher the better. So as you're doing your testing and you see the use of color, use a color checking tool like Who Can Use to check the contrast of colors. For icons or non-text graphics, it's got to be higher than 3:1, and some of these examples on SUST would not meet that criteria. Focus indicators ideally should have 4.5:1 contrast ratio and have a certain size. When we're presenting text, it should have at least 4.5:1 contrast to the color of the background. And if we're using links and the links are not underlined, we have to be sure that there's sufficient contrast between the link color and the body text color. And it's actually more straightforward just to make links underlined than have to calculate this. But I'll be pointing out some tools that can help with this in a moment. So here's just a review of those color ratios. 7:1 is the enhanced level, so that's the AAA level. There's a great tool called Button Buddy where you can put in your colors to make sure that buttons have appropriate color use and are differentiated appropriately between focus color, hover color, and normal state color. And WebAIM have a very useful link contrast checker. And if we're using the brand, the university brand, we can use the color matrix to check very quickly which color combinations we can use. There are some who might deliberately turn off animations at the operating system layer, and we need to be sure by testing this no animations or reduced motion mode, that any sites that do have animation have those animations disabled when that mode is turned on. And there's a few other useful tools. Headings map will show you where there are missing headings that are used with empty values, as we can see here on the university homepage, or where we've dropped from heading level 2 to heading level 5 without heading level 3 and 4 in between. Screen readers will often use headings to navigate through a page, and so it's important that they follow the right sequence. There's a very useful bookmarklet that can help you to check that you're meeting the required level of icon size or target size, so that if you were using a touch device, that it's going to if you follow this criterion, then you'll be sure that it's very unlikely that people will accidentally tap an icon because it was too close to the one that they didn't want to tap. And there's quite a few different disability simulators. It can only give you an impression, of course, but they can give you an idea of how a site will behave for people with different impairments. And that covers about 23 of those success criteria so far, and I feel that those are pretty standard and repeatable things that you can do. But what about the rest? I've made a spreadsheet where you can see all of the success criteria, some draft guidance on how to test, and some examples of the kind of information you would want to put in. And in the full slide deck, I've gone through a number of different resources from both the government, the NHS, and other areas, which have some quite good kind of checklists and workflows to look at in terms of accessibility testing. But those success criteria can be quite complex, and I found this presentation from Ben Allen, who works at PNC Bank, where they use a testing methodology called Gherkin, which is like a business readable method of creating tests where you have a scenario. So he's done those for lots of accessibility testing. So it makes it much more understandable if you are unfamiliar with accessibility testing. And I won't read out these examples, but you can see them there. And I know, talking to David, that Gherkin is something that is being used as a testing methodology at iSolutions. And at PNC, they set up libraries where people who are doing testing, if they knew what components were being used in an interface, they could copy those and then start immediately testing through them. Unfortunately, they didn't make this available publicly, but it's a nice example of an approach that might work for us. So guided tests are where you're kind of being taken through how to do the test, and Accessibility Insights offers this as well. It will take you through testing pretty much all of the WCAG, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, A and AA level of tests. And once you've completed that, it will provide you with a report which also states the failures. And I'd say that's probably the most practical way to get started, because it teaches you as you go. And to test one page using that method should take between 30 minutes and an hour once you've got used to it. And if you want to practice accessibility testing, the University of Washington have a site called Accessible University, where they have examples of good and bad practice, explaining what's happened in each, and show you how you can do that testing. When you are testing, you'll be wanting to record the kind of information you'd be recording anyway. Steps to repeat, details about the client, perhaps which component is affected. Is it the accordion? Is it a carousel? And what workflow or sequence has been impacted, and ideally to state what the accessibility violation is and the priority, which I will get to. And there's a great presentation from Dave Rupert, who is the lead developer at Paravel, where he shares further strategies for organizing accessibility tickets and issues. So I definitely recommend taking a look at that. But how do we prioritize accessibility issues? Well, the Agile Accessibility Handbook actually gives you a good example. Breaks them down into critical, serious, major and minor. And so for critical is an example here that I've highlighted. The issue affects at least one disability such that a crucial business function cannot be used by a user with an affected disability. So being unable to access COVID information because you're unable to use a mouse, I would assess as critical. And you can have a look through in the slide deck some of these examples. If that seems a bit wordy for you, Alison Walden's been working with Fiat Chrysler for 3 years on improving the accessibility across their web estate. And her presentation, she actually shared her definitions of priority level, and those are far fewer words there. That might be perhaps a bit more usable for us perhaps. When we get to looking at the build process, there's actually plugins for development environments that will highlight possible accessibility issues as you go. So those are available for both Visual Studio Code and for Atom. And there's lots of resources and add-ons for frameworks as well. Thinking about frameworks, it's worth making sure that if any default aspects of those frameworks, for example, these Bootstrap links and buttons, they might not be accessible out of the box. So it's worth checking on those as well. And I found quite a cool tool called Axlinter, which will go through source control and identify issues in pull requests and even automatically suggest resolutions to them. When we think about design, there we can do a number of things. This presentation from Anna Cook at Recurly, what she describes is a way of using these concepts from a book called Atomic Design, which most designers are probably familiar with, breaking down your designs and wireframes into tokens, for example, our color palettes, the fonts that we use, the logos and headings, making sure that we set those at accessible levels at the beginning. Then as we start to build a component, starting with some of those, what they call as atoms, like a drop-down menu and buttons and so on, making sure that we have accessible patterns for those, so that once we start building that component, which they call a molecule, that will be accessible because the foundational parts also have the accessibility. So like the screen reader will be able to use the drop-down menu, that the buttons have accessible contrast, so that then once we've created a finished component that's going to be used, that should be accessible, that we set our templates and ensured their accessibility at the beginning. So when we finish with a page where we've added several components into a page, we should be in a good place where many of the accessibility issues will already have been sorted. And then we could talk further about web components. There are many guides. This one from the World Wide Web Consortium explains how to make typical web components accessible following best practices. So you've got examples there for accordions, carousels, and so on. And all of that is available for free. And you could also utilize component libraries. Many are available which provide accessible components that you can use and repurpose. And I know that the OneWeb team audited all of their components and design patterns for accessibility and tested them with users, and I think they'll be sharing some further work in that area soon. So some of the benefits there are that you can take things off the shelf, build faster and more efficiently, and a lot of the accessibility work has already been done, but you would still need to do that testing for assurance as well. At Verizon, Brandy Borer explained how for many designers, the language of those success criteria can be a little bit impenetrable. So in their example, they rewrote them so that they could define when we create a form, it will meet these, we need to meet these aims, or when we, for example, on the right with that example brand guideline, that we will use a certain contrast ratio. And we should still consider involving users of all abilities in co-design as well. Fable Tech Labs works with Slack, Shopify and Walmart, and their quote here is that the best way to assess accessibility is to include end users and hear their perspectives. And I know that OneWeb also have done some work in this area, and I believe they're going to be publishing some posts about how it's worked for them as well. When we create wireframes, the Agile Accessibility Handbook recommends annotating accessibility features of those. So like stating what the roles will be, their default states and names, so that if the person creating the wireframe were not the same person building the interface, that the person doing that building won't have to guess at what's intended by the wireframe, it will already have been annotated. And the Agile Accessibility Handbook also recommends building a pattern library, a component library, so that rather than, say, every team building their own modal, we could have the iSolutions modal, which every team can use and has been checked for accessibility. But what about at the beginning? Then we need to consider how can we include accessibility within our requirements. So perhaps we could add a section to the project brief and business case, as there already is a section for the equality, diversity and inclusion. We could specify that the deliverable of an accessibility statement as part of a project. I'll be telling you more about accessibility statements in a moment. We could create a standard work package for the creation of accessibility statements. And I'm talking about accessibility statements because they're part of our legal responsibility. The public sector body's web accessibility regulations have been in place since 2018, and I'll be referring them to them as PS bar for the sake of brevity in the next slides. So they set testable standards for us to prove that our websites, documents and apps are accessible, and a way for us as organizations, public sector organizations, to report on the compliance. And we need to comply with the accessibility requirement, which is to make websites, mobile apps and documents perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. And that might sound familiar to you because that's the same language used in the accessibility guidelines. And for each of the in-scope services, we should produce an accessibility statement in accordance with a model statement provided by the government and keep that under regular review. The government recommends a yearly review, and will be presumed to be in conformance with that requirement to the extent that we meet these European standards, which despite Brexit, these are still in law that we need to meet the standard EN 301549. 3 relevant chapters are for web, non-web documents, so that's the Office documents, PDFs, and chapter 11 there is for software, which in this case refers to mobile apps. And I've shown the version history there to show it's a living document. And once WCAG 2.2 is released in a couple of months' time, I would expect it to be included within this European standard before Christmas. So this, in terms of what's in scope, this has been increasing over the past years. It now applies to all of our websites, Office documents, extranets and intranets, as long as they're still in active use. And from June this year, it will apply to mobile apps. And the accessibility statement that's required for each of those in-scope services should state what is not accessible and why. And in order to know what is not accessible, we also will need to know what is accessible, which means doing that accessibility testing. For anything that isn't accessible, what the alternatives are, how users can contact us for help, and how users can raise complaints if they're not happy with the service that we provide. And that should be based on a template, the accessibility statement, based on a template provided by the Central Digital and Data Office. But it's also an opportunity to provide more information. So we could link to our other statements, provide more information about how assistive technology could be used with the site. And of course, that doesn't benefit only those with impairments, but I'm sure you've been in many Teams calls where someone has said, oh, could you increase the size of the text? And someone has just increased their browser zoom or increase the OneNote size so that everyone can see regardless of the monitor they're using at home. And I would believe that maintaining these accessibility statements can really put us on the road to building a culture where we are removing any barriers that we find for the use of our services and encouraging our customers and users to report accessibility defects that they find to help us improve our services and remove barriers. A great example is from the University of Kent. They have 35 accessibility statements for their services, and they've also got a statement written by their DVC Education and Student Experience where they say we all have a responsibility to ensure that everything is as accessible as possible. And I think it's really nice to see that level of buy-in. But we're not always creating services and systems ourselves. We'll be buying them as well. So it's important that we require vendors to provide accessibility conformance reports. Those might be based on a voluntary product accessibility template. We should be asking them about their accessibility roadmap, what they're doing. Are they training their own staff in accessibility, and lobbying our current providers to improve accessibility of the services that we are buying from them and to keep their accessibility conformant reports up to date. If you've not seen a VPAT, voluntary product accessibility template, this is an example from Blackboard where it lists the web content accessibility guideline criteria on the left, states to what extent they're supported, and then adds any information and explanation. And Hassle Inclusion this week released a really useful poster which has a lot of tips for what questions to ask when you're procuring a new service. And there's a Disability Equality Procurement Working Group, which is a new group which is going to be investigating this area, and I believe that Dave Key and Tim Brodie will be representing iSolutions on that group. And you might say, Matt, but we've got the technical architecture group's non-functional requirements for cloud-based services, and they state as mandatory that we meet at least WCAG AA, and that's excellent, and that's great for once we get a service in. But what happens if we start to customize it? If we do something as simple as changing the colors, we might make the accessibility worse. Or if we add new features and functionality on top of it, that's not necessarily going to be accessible. So while it's great to have that gateway at the beginning, we need to do that at the end as well, which takes me to looking at that release process. So as part of our Go Live checklist, we could add accessibility statements as a requirement before a service could go live, and also then set a date when it will need to be reviewed and who would own that. We could add within our request for change templates an accessibility testing section and add a checkpoint about checking whether the accessibility statement should be updated if we've done an upgrade or a change to a service. We could also add accessibility to project closure and lessons learned reports, and I think it would be a nice thing also to add within a benefits realization review. And to add to that, there are tools available to provide accessibility dashboards using some of the tools like Axe and Pally that I mentioned earlier, so we could get a review of the current state of accessibility in terms of what can be automatically determined, and I've got a few guides for that on the slides and more in the handout. You might be thinking, but Matt, who's going to do all of this? Well, here's an example from the Russell Group, from a Russell Group competitor university. So they've got their Chief Information Officer responsible for the IT accessibility policy, product owners and service owners responsible for the accessibility statements, product teams and product owners responsible for the testing, and so on. So you can see it kind of fits quite well within the kind of ITIL framework that we're already using. So what have we covered? We've looked at typical barriers users might experience, not all of them, but some of them, with a few examples from our own services. We've looked at how we could shift left. We've looked at some practical steps in accessibility testing, and we've talked a little bit about digital accessibility and the law. And just to go over again, if we say at the release stage, it has got to be accessible, and we say at the requirement stage, we want it to be accessible, and we're going to test that it's accessible, then it doesn't matter which techniques we use to get there, as long as we can get through those gateways that we add. So while I've shown some examples that are out there, there are many others, and I know that different teams will prefer to use different tools and techniques, and so it's not saying to use one particular method, but by placing these gates at the beginning and the end, it should help us on that journey toward amazing accessibility. So what do we do now? Well, I'd say have a look at some of those techniques and try them out, discuss them within your teams, and share back to our communities of practice your reflections, and investigate the accessibility of your own services. Can they all be used with a keyboard? Can you zoom to 400% and use everything without having to scroll left or right? Because I know, talking with some colleagues from SAA, there's some people have had to use their TVs, some people are borrowing like their son's laptop. I know some who only got internet for the first time at home because of lockdown, having to work from home. And so there's some really important ways that we can make their life easier by ensuring the accessibility of the services that we provide. And ultimately, although this will be for the department to agree centrally, building accessibility into our processes. Our digital accessibility community of practice is open to everyone in iSolutions who wishes to join. And if you want to learn more and connect with other people in this area, JISC have some great resources, mailing list and a Teams area. The Access Technology Higher Education Network mailing list is an American education-based mailing list that focuses on accessibility. And from a technical point of view, the WebAIM mailing list is a great resource, even just to sign up and then see what kind of things are being talked about. The Agile Accessibility Handbook is free. There's a copy of it in the library within our digital accessibility community of practice. And I would also recommend the Bootcamper's Guide to Web Accessibility. That is not free, but I can tell you about it and perhaps share my copy of it with you if you are interested. And I'd also recommend, particularly if you're brand new to accessibility, signing up for the 10 days of accessibility. Each day you'll be sent an email with information describing a different topic within accessibility. And you can sign up to the WCAG of the day, where each day you're emailed one success criterion from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines with explanations and links telling you more about it. But on this Global Accessibility Awareness Day, what we don't want is to not consider it again until next year's Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So there is a concept called the Global Accessibility Awareness Day Pledge. And I wonder what within iSolutions we could pledge to do by this time next year. Because I believe there is a wave of momentum towards accessibility. So you might have lots of different things happening around within and outside of the university. I like to pick out Blackboard Ally that will be rolling out, will be explained to staff their responsibility to ensure accessibility of their content that they upload to Blackboard. And if they were to ask, well, what are we doing about it in iSolutions? I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, no, that's for you. It's not what we do. But we should be walking the walk as well as talking the talk. There's that new skills and post-16 education bill that was announced at the beginning of the week. And if the university wants to benefit from that, then it's totally in our interest to ensure that all of our services that students use are accessible. But that's how it might work for us. We might want to add some of those elements into our processes to make our journey towards amazing accessibility. But ultimately, it's up to us as a department how we're going to get from our current state to amazing accessibility and beyond. So thank you very much. And I'll stop now and ask Tamsin if there are any questions that we can cover from the chat. Thank you.